The militiamen there have said that they would, open fire on federal authorities if they came to evict them. Some of them I don't believe. I think some of them it's bravado. But there are one or two guys there, certainly, that I think would be willing to pull a trigger. Hi, I'm Henry Langston, and today I'll be taking your questions about the occupation of the Malheur Wildlife Refuge by Ammon Bundy's militia, who say they're there to protect local ranchers from encroachment by the BLM and other federal government agents. So let's go to our first guest.
Hey Henry, thanks for coming on the line today. And before we go to our first guy on Skype, I just want to let everyone at home know that we did reach out to Ammon Bundy and invite him to join the show today. He didn't get back to us, so
it's a shame.
Yeah, if he calls me right now, we still have time to get him on the show.
All right.
But without any further ado, let's go ahead and say hey to Dave. Dave, you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi Dave, how's it going?
I'm good. How are you?
Not bad, thanks.
Awesome. My first question of the day will be, are the Hammonds the real issue, or are they being used as an excuse to act against the BLM?
Well, the Hammonds case was something that Ammon Bundy and Ryan Payne, another senior militiaman, were both very interested in a few months ago, actually. Both of them arrived in Burns, Oregon around November, December time, trying to talk to the Hammonds to try and raise more of attention to their case. There was talk of a big rally to be held, but also the possible chance of having an armed occupation or occupation of a government building to attract more attention to the case. And just a bit of a primer, the Hammonds were a local ranching family who had been accused, sentenced, and did prison time for arson on federal lands, overgrazing lands. Fires from their property spread to federal lands. They did time for that, but they were resentenced, retrialed by the Oregon state under terrorism law because their initial sentencing was apparently too lenient, and so they were told that actually they're going to have to serve the full 5 years that they were meant to under the Terrorism Act of 1996. So a lot of people were very angry at that they'd already served time and now they were going to have to go back to prison. And the Ammon Bundy and others had sort of latched on to this and wanted to raise awareness of the issue, of how unfair they perceived the issue to be. But the Hammonds seemingly wanted help. They welcomed them. They held meetings with these people, but they did not want some sort of armed confrontation or occupation. They were happy to have a rally in town, which did happen, and they always said from the start that they would comply with the order to go back to prison. They were never seemingly going to resist that, though it was something that Ryan Payne and Ammon Bundy seemingly had tried to get them to do, but obviously that didn't happen. And so after this rally happened, Bundy and some other of these militia guys then sort of broke off and said, who's going to join us down at the Wildlife Refuge? So you can certainly see that there is the Hammond case has been taken advantage of, for sure. And now we have this situation where the majority of the town, although happy about the support that the Hammonds received, with the help from Ammon Bundy and some of the other militia guys, but unhappy mainly that this refuge had been taken over, and not just been taken over by unarmed protesters, but people with weapons. The local townsfolk seemingly were very unhappy at this, and so now you have this situation which is ongoing that at the moment it doesn't seem to be much of an end in sight.
That's awesome. I appreciate that. That elaborates very well for me. My second question will be, these guys seem well-intentioned, but it might be that they're doing more harm than good. What are they really trying to get done when they don't have the support of the community behind them?
I mean, it's a really, really complicated situation. What you've just said is what people were saying to us. We appreciate the sentiment, but the way you've gone about it, we don't support. The Wildlife Refuge has been around for over 100 years. It's not a new it's not a new federal refuge. It's not something that the people have been upset about. It's been there their whole lives. Local ranchers, at least ones that we spoke to, didn't want that land to be handed back to them and to the locals. It's 187,000 acres of land. It's not something that you can just give to some local ranchers who will suddenly be able to inherit it and be able to work the land effectively. Over that 100 years, the federal government have built an infrastructure that can provide services to protect that land and keep it open to the public. And yeah, it's very complicated. Local ranchers do feel that the BLM and other federal agencies do flex their power too much. That's what they're saying. Others disagree with them, saying that actually this land and their industry is heavily subsidized by the BLM and that they're getting a good deal. So for us, we were getting some conflicting viewpoints on how the federal government treats them, but ultimately unhappy at the way that this militia were going about it. And also, the militia couldn't properly express to us how they would actually achieve that aim of handing the refuge back to the people, and how then they would effectively look after it. It's a lot of land, it would cost a lot of money to look after it, a lot of infrastructure. Also, if the BLM withdrew from the area, if the federal agencies withdrew from looking after this land, a lot of people in the local area would lose their jobs. So how would you suddenly employ 20% of the local population? Seemingly, I think their demands were unrealistic a little bit, and they struggled to kind of get that across to people as to how they would kind of solve this situation that they've got themselves into.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I appreciate it.
No worries, man.
I think you kind of covered everything that I was questioning with this whole situation.
That's great. Well, thanks for coming on, man.
Yeah, thanks, Dave.
No problem. Thank you very much.
Hey, Henry, so we are getting a lot of questions via Twitter right now as well. So Trent sent us this one. What is the standoff costing the taxpayers of Oregon? These are the guys who are ultimately going to have to foot the bill.
Yeah. Okay, so a local county judge actually a few days ago said that he wanted to essentially make Ammon Bundy and his militia foot the bill for the occupation, and he was calculating it at around $60,000 to $75,000 per day that the refuge has been occupied. And the way he was calculating that cost is that he was saying that this is the cost of extra law enforcement into the state that has to suddenly put up with. It's not just local law enforcement. They've had to bring in more police from out of state, from within the state, from further afield. The schools have been closed. There's been road closures. Essentially the town has been majorly disrupted with all of this. And obviously the refuge itself is closed to the public. So it's costing a lot of money, seemingly. The county judge didn't say how they'd be able to make Bundy and his men actually pay for it, but it's seemingly something that's being talked about and something that the local authorities definitely want to do.
All right. Well, I hope that answers your question, Trent. And with that, why don't we go to our next Skype caller, and that is Tom, who's calling us from St. Louis, Missouri. What's up, Tom?
Hey, how are you doing today?
Great, thank you. You?
Yeah, my question is, how are the militants receiving provisions, and does the federal government plan to cut them off?
Well, at the moment, there are no roadblocks. There's nothing stopping people moving backwards and forwards between the refuge and Burns, the nearest town, which is about 30 miles away. The militia guys, they come into town, they pick up food, they order pizza. The local pizza joint, Figaro, is seemingly doing pretty well out of that. There's a Safeway in town, so people are, shopping, getting provisions. They have asked for more provisions. We've seen a couple of videos, call-outs for more snacks and things like that. You'd think they might have been a little bit better prepared if they were going to be there for years, as they put it. But so far, the federal authorities, local law enforcement is not stopping anyone going backwards and forwards currently. Some people are annoyed at that they want this to essentially end as soon as possible. But, law enforcement hasn't done anything so far, other than actually offer to get the Bundy militia out of the state. So we're probably just going to throw to a quick clip that shows the first meeting between Ammon Bundy and Harney County Sheriff Dave Ward.
I just want to come out and offer you guys the opportunity to help you get out and get home and resolve this thing peacefully. That's I'm willing to get you an escort all the way out of the state.
We're here for the people of Harney County. We're here because the people were ignored. They're bringing up legitimate concerns, and yet, Sheriff, you would not address those concerns.
I'm here because the citizens of Harney County have asked me to come out and ask you folks to peacefully leave.
We pose no threat to the community whatsoever at all. It's time to get the schools open, let your community get back to living. We do not pose a threat.
That's what I'm asking for.
But that can be done without us leaving.
Well, it only takes one unstable person to show up, and we know that.
So you can see there that the sheriff, his first priority is to ensure the safety of people of Harney County and make sure that this does not end in another sort of Ruby Ridge or Waco situation. There's been a lot of criticism that local law enforcement haven't gone in there to try and arrest these guys. And Sheriff Dave Ward, we've been to a couple of town meetings. We've seen how well respected he is within the community. There's a lot of talk of how so far the community are happy with him and what he's been doing. He's only been in office for a year. But there has been criticism from all over the United States about the lack of action. And Sheriff Dave Ward he's a former Army man. He's a veteran. I think he understands the tactical difficulties of suddenly going down there and with guns blazing, because ultimately, it's unwise. These guys, they are heavily armed. They've set up, defensive positions. They have a watchtower. They can see people coming. It would be unwise to sort of go down there looking to shut this down in a way that the militia might see as a violent way. And the militiamen there some of them have said that they would, open fire on federal authorities if they came to evict them. Some of them I don't believe. I think some of them it's bravado. But there are one or two guys there, certainly, that I think would be willing to pull a trigger. And ultimately, the sheriff's job is to make sure that no one is hurt and no one is killed. But also, what they're doing down there at the occupation is illegal. They have, it's criminal trespass. They've taken over this place. And so, someone is going to have to pay for that ultimately. But his job is to make sure that the peace is kept. He offered them a safe escort out of the state, which people were definitely criticizing, that instead he should be putting them in handcuffs, and that's how they should be escorted out the state. But he's in a very tough position. He doesn't want this to blow up. But then he also said in that meeting that although he'll offer them a safe passage out of the state, he said, look, if the feds want to arrest you, that's something I can't stop, and it's something that I assume the FBI and others are certainly looking into in terms of prosecutions over what's happened here. Ammon Bundy's father, Cliven, in 2014, the sort of Cliven ranch standoff, the Bundy ranch standoff, sorry, no one has done any time for what happened there. Federal agents were threatened with rifles, obviously a federal offense. Cliven Bundy didn't have to give his cattle back. And I think people obviously were upset. This man owed a lot of money to, taxpayers, and was able to seemingly get away with it. So people are upset, and I can definitely see why. But it's Dave Ward and, the people in Burns don't want a gunfight. That's the last thing they want there. So it's very tough. There's been talk of trying to cut off power to the refuge, but it seems they found out that if they did cut power to the refuge, it would also cut power to other local ranches, which is obviously something they don't want.
Yeah, thank you. That answers my question. My second question would be whether it's fair to do so or not. A lot of people associate these militants with the conservative movement at large.
Right.
Are Republican leaders trying to play damage control right now?
I mean, I haven't seen much of a response from Republican leaders over this. It's a much smaller example of what happened at the Bundy Ranch in 2014. It's more complicated in a way. I don't know. I haven't really been keeping an eye on their response too much. I've sort of been focused mainly on what's been going on the ground. And I don't think some of these people's views necessarily represent the wider Republican support base. There are issues between ranchers and the federal government, as there are in any country in the world with farming communities and the government. Where I'm from a rural area in the UK, family are in farming. They've always had issues, but you know, these guys have taken an issue that a lot of ranchers in the US have problems with, but they've chosen to do it with weapons. And you know, people you know, protest these kind of issues all the time, but without weapons. And I think their main problem is that by doing so with weapons, they have possibly made it harder for themselves to be taken seriously and for, you know, to get support from leading Republican figures, because no one's really going to take up this cause if you've got a bunch of guys waving guns around. We saw what happened in 2014 with the Bundy Ranch, that, you know, that was widely perceived as a success for his supporters at the time, you know, but ultimately they committed crimes and they got away with it. And, you know, if you're a Republican lawmaker or a Republican figure, you know, you can't support that. So, you know, they've put themselves and everyone who are in similar positions in a difficult spot.
Thank you.
No worries. Thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah, Tom, enjoy St. Louis, Missouri. So, Henry, let's go back to Twitter. We got a bunch of people who are asking about this, and I'm going to choose two of my favorite tweets.
Right.
At Bag the Nematode wants to know if these Oregon occupiers weren't white, would this still be going on? And Paulo Perez wants to know, do you think that if these guys were Native American or African American, would they receive the same response that they're receiving?
Well, I mean, both are, I guess, kind of the similar question, but you know, we saw on social media as soon as this happened that most people were complaining about that. Yeah, if these guys weren't white, that the local law enforcement and the federal authorities would probably maybe take a different stand. I can't say whether that would obviously happen or not. It's definitely the police response, at least for the rest of the US and in social media, has received a lot of negative criticism. From what I could understand being on the ground, I think the response to the situation there from law enforcement was mainly from a tactical perspective, and just the fact that they didn't want a bloodbath. They didn't want people to be shot and killed. So I think most people are pretty already made up their mind about this question. And you can definitely see why, because of numerous issues over the past 2 years. In relation to you know, police and black community. So I can definitely see why people would believe that. But I think on the ground, mainly it's down to the position that the militia are in, and you know, they're also 30 miles from anywhere. They're not posing an immediate direct threat to anyone, only if, as they've said themselves, if the feds turn up, which in itself is a very controversial statement. So I think if this was, say, in a built-up area, if this was in Burns itself, the response, I think, whether they were white, black, or Muslim, would be different. I think the federal authorities would certainly have taken a different standpoint.
All right, well, guys, I hope that answers your question. And speaking of questions, I bet Gabe's got some stuff he wants to ask us. So let's go ahead and say hey to Gabe.
Well, I had a question that came up from, I believe, Dave's question. Did the Hammonds and this Bundy, did they know each other beforehand, or did the Bundys just sort of take up their cause?
Well, I think Ammon Bundy got in touch with the Hammonds, I think around November time, offering help in regards to their case to try and raise awareness. So they had met a few times, but it seems from, I was reading some reports in the Oregon-based paper, and they did a lot of interviews over the past few weeks with locals in regards to the build-up to what happened at the refuge. And it seems that, yes, they had meetings a few months prior to the occupation and the rally in the town, which happened just prior to the occupation. And they were looking at ways to try and raise awareness, like I mentioned, but it seemingly the Hammonds disagreed with the Bundys pushing for an occupation or a confrontation. They wanted a peaceful rally that helped raise awareness around the case, but they were always seemingly they were going to hand themselves in on the Monday, regardless of what happened. You know, yes, they wanted people to be aware that their case was, you know, pretty unfair. Possibly that's what they were saying, and they just wanted people to know that they didn't want what's happening now at the refuge.
I see. My own personal question was that they had a constitutional. They keep crying the constitutional. The Constitution. Do we know what they're specifically referring to in regards to the Constitution and how they feel BLM is violating it?
I mean, the whole time I was there, I was, really trying to get an understanding about what it is exactly that the BLM are doing in that area that are forcing them to take up weapons at a wildlife refuge enjoyed by the local community. And I always seemingly got not very straight answers. They would just keep saying the Constitution at me, and it never really seemed, they could never really seem to get to the bottom of the issue, and also put across to me how they were going to effectively change that. I think the problem was that Bundy and the guys who accompanied him when they were in Burns, they wanted the Hammonds and the local population to side with them and occupy a building space to try and raise awareness for issues surrounding local ranches. The Hammond case is difficult because, to use as an example for their cause, because, at the end of the day, they did commit a crime. Arson was carried out, and they were charged, they were found guilty, they did some time, they were going to do some more time. But that in itself is a rather specific case. It doesn't it's not like a common case for ranchers in the area. It's not one that they've all suffered with. So obviously when the Hammonds then rejected the idea of an occupation, seemingly they were going to go ahead and do it anyway. Ryan Payne, who's a senior militiaman, in the weeks prior to the occupation, had been going down to the refuge on his own, scoping out the place to see how they could take it over, and what kind of presence there was there. So they were always planning this, and actually the BLM knew who Ryan Payne was. The Fish and Wildlife Service, who were also down there, they had actually put his photograph up in the refuge, saying, this man was involved at the Bundy standoff in 2014. So, they were aware that something may happen, or at least this guy was snooping around. And so, given that they didn't have the Hammond support, I think basically they were maybe scrabbling for some sort of cause to take up. They kept saying that local ranchers were there with them, supporting them. And, I asked a few ranchers who were there, like, what is it exactly, that the BLM are doing to you that you are so upset about? And in one case, this young rancher, he just couldn't articulate to me what exactly it was. So for me, it was difficult to try and get a handle on the situation. It seems the whole Constitution stuff was a bit of an excuse for them to be there. It didn't seem to make much sense. It certainly didn't fit in with anything that to do with the Hammond case. So it was a bit confusing at times to try and they're relatively media savvy, but ultimately when pressed on, their demands and how they were going to achieve them, their answers were never really very straight. So when I spoke to other ranchers, they were saying that their demands were just essentially completely unrealistic. So we're going to throw to a clip now with a local rancher called Tom Sharp, who was saying, their demands, they're just not going to happen.
Harney County is roughly the size of the state of Massachusetts, and 73% of our total land area, acreage, is managed by the federal government. So the federal government has built for the last 100 years an infrastructure of management offices and services that they provide, all the way from suppressing wildland fire in the summer months to a system for handling grazing permits. If the federal government were to turn that back to the local state or the local county, how would we support that? How would we pay for that? How could we possibly manage that much responsibility in a way that the federal systems have been built over the last 100 years to do?
So yeah, you can see the reaction from ranchers who are from the area, know what they're talking about. The majority of the militiamen down at the refuge are from out of state. They don't really, they don't fully understand the issues in the area. Some of them aren't even ranchers, so they don't even understand how a lot of that works, I think. So it's a shame, because I think, there are some ranchers are obviously going to be better off than others. Some are going to struggle to pay grazing fees, however subsidised they are. Others may be able to pay them easily because they've got a bigger farm, more cattle, easily done. So I'm not saying that there aren't issues. I'm positive that there are. It's just that the people we met couldn't quite get it across to us what it is exactly they were so upset about. I think people are generally upset about the amount of land the federal government has in the area. As Tom mentioned, it's a hell of a lot they look after. But that doesn't mean that they'll be able to farm it easily and affordably. It would be a real challenge for them. So this whole constitutional stuff, I think a lot of the time is a bit of a smokescreen for the militia and how they're trying to handle the situation.
Oh, thanks.
No worries, man.
Yeah, thank you, Gabe. So, Henry, back to Twitter. We got a bunch of people asking us basically the same question. So I'm going to take a look at a couple of my favorites. Okay. DZ wants to know, how come the National Guard isn't responding with tear gas, armored vehicles, and snipers? Well, Darcy is wondering why they're not sending a tater tot casserole laced with Tylenol PM. But Keith's kind of getting to the point here. Doesn't an action embolden this group and similar groups to take increasingly dangerous acts? There haven't been any real consequences for these guys yet. So yeah. What do you think?
I think that's a really good point. If you look at what happened in 2014 at Clive and Bundy's ranch, no one there seemingly got into any trouble for what they did by pointing weapons at federal agents and forcing them out of the area, essentially giving that movement, that small movement, a victory, which I think ultimately emboldened the people there. And if that hadn't have happened, I'm not sure that the occupation of the Malheur Wildlife Refuge would have happened either. They know that they could understand that there was a way they could make sure that they weren't turfed out straight away with the National Guard or tear gas or Tylenol casseroles. So I think it is a problem. I think law enforcement and local government and the federal government is going to have to see how they handle these situations. Obviously, the main priority is ensuring that no one's killed and no one's injured, but if this keeps happening, then more and more groups will be emboldened to possibly carry out similar acts, and that's something that can't afford to happen. Now, whether that's they just change their tactics in the way they deal with these, and if they nip these situations in the bud, or if they try and help ranchers or other people in similar situations and listen to their demands. The people of Burns County we're very happy that at least their issues surrounding the Hammond case and just the general difficulty of working with the BLM has been raised to the international community as well as people in the United States. We're Vice, we're a global company, we were there. So they're happy about that, but they're unhappy at the methods because no one wants people running around waving guns, I don't think. And certainly they didn't want the disruption to their town. And if they do have legitimate issues, the last thing they need is for the movement that's meant to be championing them being ridiculed for carrying weapons. And we've seen a lot of social media criticizing these guys and essentially taking the piss out of them, as some of what they've done has been warranted. But it's hard if you've got real grievances and then this group comes along claiming to champion them and then people don't take it seriously. You're in a tough spot. So I think ultimately the federal government needs to figure out a way of dealing with what was an illegal act effectively, but also listening to the demands of people who feel they're not being represented and are struggling in their relationships with the federal agencies.
All right. Well, I hope that answers your question, guys. And Darcy, if you could answer one of mine, please tweet me and tell me what is a tater tot casserole. Henry, before we end the show, we got one more caller. So let's go ahead and say Joe, who's calling from London. Hey, Joe.
Hi, Henry.
Hi, Joe.
Mike.
How's it going?
Hi. It's good, thank you. How are you?
Good. Good to hear a fellow Englishman.
I wanted to ask a little bit about the relationship between Ammon Bundy and the other militia groups who've arrived since the occupation began, and whether they share the same goals, and if you thought that if Bundy were to decide to leave, would he be able to convince the others to come with him?
That's a great question. it's a disparate amount of groups there. You know, you've got guys from Arizona, you've got guys from Oregon, but not necessarily in the state, some guys from Washington State, from Idaho. It's a real mix of guys with, you know, differing backgrounds. John Ritzheimer, who was in the film, he's mainly famous for anti-Islam rallies in Arizona. So, you know, you've got that side of this whole movement there. You've got people like Ryan Payne, who organized the defense of the Bundy Ranch in 2014, both actually former military guys. But when we left over the weekend, another group turned up called the Idaho 3%ers, who were part of a wider group called the Pacific Patriot Network, who were, they themselves called themselves a neutral party to the whole situation, but they turned up heavily armed, majority of them with assault rifles, and they turned up at the refuge claiming they were going to act as a buffer against any hostile forces, so they could prevent a Waco-style event. Now, they weren't invited by Ammon Bundy, and supposedly he wasn't happy at their arrival. And there was a town meeting last week, where a smaller town meeting, where they claimed that they were there to protect the people at the refuge, but also the people of Burns, Oregon, from outside forces. They wouldn't necessarily go into detail about who they were, but they did mention other patriots. So I thought they were patriots, and then they also claimed they weren't a militia. So it got a bit confusing this week with different groups down there, and seemingly there is a bit of friction between the militia at the refuge and this Pacific Patriot Network, from my understanding. And you know, you've got the law enforcement stuck in the middle of all this, trying to make sense of it all. So it's become a little bit more complicated now. And since we've seen a fence at the refuge has been torn up, apparently in order to offer the refuge to local cattle ranchers. But where the fence was and whose land it borders, the rancher said that he didn't want the fence to be taken down. He didn't want to graze his cattle on the land. So it's getting a bit messy, and apparently on tomorrow, the militia itself is heading into the town to hold their own meeting to discuss with the locals about the future of the occupation and what's going to be happening over, you know, the coming weeks and months. You know, maybe it will come to an end. We don't know. But I think if Bundy left, I think some people would follow him, but I think there would be some people within the refuge who would want to carry on. But without the Bundys and other senior figures like Lavoy Finicum, I don't think it would necessarily carry on.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks, Joe.
All right. Well, Henry, with that, I think I've got one last question from you.
Okay.
And this is from Josh on Twitter. What do you think is going to be the lasting impact on this occupation out in Oregon on the wider Patriot movement?
Oh, as you said, Michael, good question. I think that's a really interesting one because, as we just mentioned, you know, there is friction between the groups in Burns itself, but then also other patriot groups, other militia groups have come out against the occupation. So, you know, it hasn't, I think, you know, at the very beginning, Ammon Bundy, you know, made a call out for more militia to turn up to help them, to reinforce their position, but it just didn't really happen. You know, he wouldn't answer my question as, you know, how many guys have you actually got here occupying this refuge? And he was claiming, you know, for security reasons, I can't possibly say. But, you know, we spent a few days down there and we never saw really anything more than 20 militia members at the refuge at any one time. So I think they were really struggling to gain support. You could see that on social media, you could see that in the press, and you could see it down at the refuge. So I think ultimately, though, it's probably a bit of a blip in terms of the wider patriot movement. I think if there's another bigger, more what they would consider a legitimate cause, that groups would flock to that in the future. But I think this one, you know, at the very beginning, they struggled to get their point across. They didn't have seemingly the support of the local population. So if you're a militia member from, New Hampshire or, you know, Florida, why would you travel that distance to essentially stand in the cold waiting for the guys to kind of come up with a plan? So I think it won't have that much of a lasting effect in the end, actually.
Well, with that, Henry, why don't we call it a day?
Okay. Well, thank you for all the guys that called in, and thank you for sending in your questions on Twitter. Let's keep an eye on what's going on at the ranch. Hopefully there'll be some sort of end in sight soon.
This is the time for selflessness for our country. Thomas Paine said, "I prefer peace, but if trouble must come, you let it come in my time, so that my children may know peace."
Amen.